Once upon a time, in the hill country of Jerusalem, before the sun rose over the palace, a man waited beneath an old olive tree. His name was Hushai. His cloak was plain, his sandals dusty, but behind his quiet eyes lived the wisdom of 1,000 late-night conversations and a loyalty that ran deeper than any throne. He didn't need armor to be brave. He didn't need a title to be trusted. What he needed was to be ready, because danger was coming, not from outside the kingdom, but from within. The city had grown uneasy. People whispered behind baskets and pulled their children closer when soldiers passed. Rumors clung to the stone walls like damp fog. Absalom, King David's own son, was planning something. And it wasn't just rebellion, it was betrayal. Hushai knew the boy, knew the charm in his voice, the fire in his ambition, and the bitterness that had grown after the tragedy with Tamar. Absalom didn't just want justice, he wanted power. And power, Hushai had learned, could turn sons into strangers. Inside the palace, David paced. He had ruled through wars, through giants, through mistakes and mercy. But this was different. "My own son," David whispered one night, gripping the stone windowsill, "my own flesh is rising against me." Hushai stepped out of the shadows. "Then we don't meet him with swords," he said calmly. "We meet him with something stronger." David turned. "What's stronger than swords?" Hushai met his gaze. "A voice on the inside." The next morning, the king's escape began, quietly, soft sandals, no trumpets, no parades, just a trail of loyal hearts following a broken one. But Hushai, he stayed behind. David had asked him to be the eyes, the ears, and the voice that would twist the enemy's plans from within. "You could be killed," one of the captains warned. "I could," Hushai replied, adjusting his robe. "But then again, I might just be the reason David sees the sunrise again." So Hushai walked back through the city gates, alone, unnoticed, and made his way to the court of Absalom. A man with no sword, a man with no army, just wisdom in his heart and a mission from the king. Hushai's sandals dragged a line through the dust as he entered Jerusalem's main square. The streets were quieter now, emptied of loyalty, filled with suspicion. Every merchant's gaze lingered longer than it should have. Every guard gripped their spear tighter than before. The city had changed, not in its buildings, but in its heart. Absalom was king now. At least he thought he was. And Hushai? He was about to walk into the middle of it. As he approached the palace steps, 2 guards blocked his path. "You served David," one said gruffly. "I did," Hushai replied. "Then why are you here?" He didn't blink. "Because I will serve the one who now wears the crown." A long silence. Then the second guard nodded once and stepped aside. Inside the throne room, gold glinted from every angle. The sun filtered through stained glass, casting shadows in the shape of lions and olive branches. But the real drama wasn't in the architecture. It was in the eyes of the men inside. Ahithophel stood near the throne, David's former advisor, now twisted by bitterness. Everyone knew his advice was sharp enough to split kingdoms. His eyes flicked toward Hushai the moment he entered. And on the throne sat Absalom, tall, radiant, deadly. He leaned forward with a smirk. "Hushai the Archite, I didn't think you'd have the courage to show your face." Hushai bowed. "Long live the king." Absalom raised an eyebrow. "The king? You mean me?" I mean the one who sits on the throne in Jerusalem, Hushai answered smoothly. Even Ahithophel flinched. Absalom studied him. You were my father's friend. And I still am, Hushai replied, but I also love this nation. If the Lord has allowed you to rise, then I will serve for its good. A heavy silence filled the room. Then Absalom laughed. Well spoken. Let's see how well you serve, old man. There's a war coming, and we'll need every voice at this table. That night Hushai sat quietly at a far end of the planning table, while Absalom toasted himself, and Ahithophel laid out strategies like traps on a game board. Hushai listened. Every name, every location, every secret. Then he waited. For the right moment, it came quickly. We should strike now, Ahithophel urged. Take David while he's weary. I'll lead the charge. I'll bring back only the king, alive. Absalom looked around the table. Hushai, what say you? The room went still, and Hushai smiled softly, as if speaking to a foolish child. David is no ordinary soldier. You forget. He killed Goliath when he was just a boy. He's fought more battles than you've dreamed of. Right now, he is like a bear robbed of her cubs. Attack him now, and your men will scatter like birds. He leaned forward. No, my king. Gather all Israel. Make it a show of strength. Lead them yourself. Then strike. Absalom's eyes glittered. He liked the sound of that. It fed his pride. And just like that, Hushai's plan worked. He had bought David time. Later, under cover of darkness, Hushai slipped into the servants' quarters and passed a coded message through a water carrier to Zadok the priest. Tell David, the note read, flee, cross the river tonight. The plan has changed, but the danger hasn't. Outside, the wind howled through the hills, but inside Hushai's heart, a quiet prayer rose. God, protect your king. Let my words be a shield. Let my place here serve your purpose. Because sometimes God's most loyal warriors don't stand on the battlefield. Sometimes they sit at the enemy's table. The palace had gone to sleep, or so it seemed. Absalom's confidence was a warm blanket draped over every corridor, every room. There were banquets scheduled, celebrations whispered. He truly believed the kingdom was his now, but under the cover of that false peace, the Lord was moving pieces no one could see, and Hushai was one of them. Down in the servants' courtyard, a bucket of water tipped over on purpose. A boy slipped, a guard cursed, and in the confusion, a small rolled parchment was passed from one hand to another until it made its way beneath a baker's apron. Zadok and Abiathar, the two faithful priests still loyal to David, were waiting by the southern cistern. Anything? Abiathar whispered. Zadok nodded and passed the message, still warm from the folds of the baker's clothes. He read aloud, Tell David, do not rest near the fords. Cross the Jordan tonight. They march at dawn. Abiathar sucked in a breath. He doesn't have enough men for a full crossing. He has enough if we hurry. Zadok turned to two young messengers, Jonathan and Ahimaaz, already waiting by the wall. Go, now! Meanwhile, inside the palace, Hushai could barely keep still. He sat by the high windows in a dark hallway, pretending to admire the stars, but his ears stayed tuned to every footstep, every whisper. If Absalom suspected him, if Ahithophel caught wind of the warning, everything would unravel. He heard a door open down the hall. Soft steps. Hushai stood up straight. It was Ahithophel. The man walked slowly, his face drawn like he hadn't slept in days. "You played your hand well," he muttered. Hushai didn't respond. Ahithophel turned toward the window. "I gave the better plan. You gave the shinier one. And Absalom, well, he loves his reflection too much to resist." Still, Hushai said nothing. Ahithophel looked at him then, eyes heavy with something more than suspicion, something like sorrow. When a kingdom ignores wisdom for flattery, destruction always follows. Then he walked away, and the silence that followed was colder than any threat. Miles away in the moonlit wilderness, David stood at the banks of the Jordan. The water glimmered silver beneath the stars. Men gathered behind him, exhausted, silent, waiting for the order. A rustle in the brush. "David!" Jonathan appeared, panting, the message clutched in his hand. David read it, eyes narrowing. "We cross," he said, "now." "But the children," one of the captains began. David turned, voice calm but fierce. "No one is left behind. If I have to carry the youngest myself, we cross." And by torchlight, by trembling foot, the procession began. Men, women, children, livestock, priests holding the ark, all of them trusting the message of one man still loyal in the enemy's court. Back in Jerusalem, Hushai returned to his chamber. He finally allowed himself to breathe. He didn't know if David had crossed. He didn't know if his words had truly helped, but he knew the mission was bigger than him. And he prayed once more, quietly. "Lord, I am not strong like David. I'm not wise like Solomon, but I am yours, and I'm here. Use me however you want." Because the kingdom wasn't saved by might that night. It was saved by loyalty. By a quiet, steady man standing alone in a lion's den of politics, pride, and power, waiting, trusting, speaking only when it counted, and heaven was listening. The morning sun in Jerusalem was gold, but it brought no warmth to Ahithophel. He stood alone in his chamber, the doors closed, the scrolls unopened. The corridors outside buzzed with the voices of Absalom's court, strategies, meals, celebrations, but in here it was silent. Too silent. Because Ahithophel knew what was coming. The plan he had offered, swift, surgical, devastating, had been ignored. Hushai's slow and showy idea had been chosen instead. Absalom wanted glory. Ahithophel had offered wisdom, and now everything would fall apart. He set his jaw, looked out the window toward the hills where David had likely fled, and said quietly to himself, "He will survive, and he will return." At that same hour, Hushai walked the royal garden slowly. He kept his hands behind his back and his eyes on the gravel path, pretending to ponder poetry. But inside, he was calculating. Absalom had not only chosen his plan, he had announced it publicly. "I want the people to see that I'm not just a rebel, I'm a ruler," Absalom had boasted the night before. "A king doesn't chase rats in the dark, he sets traps, and the rats come to him." Hushai smiled then, polite. But now he prayed the Lord would keep that prideful delay long enough for David to regroup, and just then he heard running footsteps behind him. "Sir Hushai!" It was one of the young palace runners, cheeks red from effort. "What is it?" Hushai asked calmly. "There's news," the boy panted. "Ahithophel, he's dead." Hushai froze. "What?" He hanged himself this morning. In his house. The guards found him." The garden seemed to stop breathing. Hushai lowered his head. He didn't speak right away. He had respected Ahithophel once, deeply. They had both served the same king, read the same prophecies, prayed to the same God. But somewhere along the way, ambition had hardened Ahithophel's heart. Still, to see such an end. "Better to lose a plan," Hushai whispered, "than to lose your hope." The runner waited. "Tell the king's advisors," Hushai said, "and have them double the guard on the city's east gate. If Absalom grows desperate, he may change course." As the runner disappeared, Hushai turned toward the fig trees, away from the fountain, away from the news. "Lord," he whispered again, "keep David safe, and help me hold my post until the end." Meanwhile, in the wilderness, David's camp stirred with energy. They had crossed the Jordan safely the night before, and the people were waking to a morning of fresh bread and stronger faith. Supplies had been secretly sent from loyalists in nearby towns. David stood beside Joab, his general, watching as the people ate and spoke softly under the trees. "They're tired," Joab said, "but they're ready." David nodded. He still wore dust on his robes, but there was a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there since the palace. "Hushai bought us time," he said. "Now we use it well." He turned to the priests. "Pray for Jerusalem, pray for wisdom, and when the time comes—" His voice trailed off. Then he finished, firmer. "When the time comes, we will return." Back in Jerusalem, Hushai entered the throne room to find Absalom lounging in silks, surrounded by new advisors and laughter. "Ah, Hushai," Absalom said with a grin. "Today we plan the parade." Hushai smiled with practiced ease, but inside he thought, the battle hasn't even begun. Still he nodded and replied, "Then let's plan it well, my king." Because sometimes the best place for a servant of God is in the room, even when the room is filled with pride, deception, and danger. God had placed Hushai here, and he would stay until the work was done. The lamps in Jerusalem flickered low that night, casting thin light across marble floors and heavy velvet curtains. Most of the palace had gone quiet, with only the soft footsteps of guards echoing in the halls. But Hushai was still awake. He sat alone in his private chamber, the doors closed, the windows cracked just enough to feel the midnight breeze on his cheek. On the table before him was a small basket, fruit, bread, and a single folded note hidden beneath the figs. The moment the door clicked shut, he opened it. Inside, written in hurried strokes, was a message from the priests Zadok and Abiathar. The words were short, but powerful. "David is safe. He is ready. Absalom may attack within days." Hushai exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with relief. David had made it across the Jordan. The people were gathering, and the Lord was still weaving his plan through every twist of rebellion and pride. Suddenly, a knock. Not loud, but sharp. He tucked the note under a loose floor tile just as the door opened and a tall, shadow-eyed servant entered. "The prince requests your presence," the servant said. "At this hour?" Hushai asked, keeping his voice steady. "He cannot sleep." Neither could I, Hushai thought. Absalom's private quarters were rich with color, deep reds, golden braids, lion-carved columns. But Hushai noticed the way the candlelight danced wildly tonight, like the room itself was restless. The young king sat shirtless near a pool, his arms resting on the stone edge, his gaze vacant. "They say Ahithophel's body still hangs from the fig tree," he said, voice low. Hushai said nothing at first. "I suppose," Absalom continued, "he couldn't handle being wrong." "Or being ignored," Hushai replied softly. Absalom turned his head, studying him. "Do you think I was wrong, Hushai?" "I think," Hushai said carefully, "you chose a path that gave us time to gather more strength. That was wise." "But if David returns," Absalom said, his voice sharper now, "do you think he will show me mercy?" Hushai walked slowly to the edge of the pool, looking down at the water. "I think mercy is always within David's reach, but so is justice." There was a pause. "You still admire him, don't you?" Hushai looked at the man before him, brilliant, bold, lost in ambition, and he spoke the truth gently. "I was loyal to your father. I remain loyal to the kingdom, and I am here now, for you." Absalom searched his eyes. "Then stay close. If war comes, I want your counsel at my side." Hushai bowed. "Always, my king." But in his heart, he prayed, "Lord, if war comes, shield your servant." By morning, the city of Jerusalem stirred with quiet tension. Messengers moved quickly, armorers sharpened blades, and Hushai slipped through the palace garden to where Zadok's son Jonathan waited near a well. "It's time," Hushai whispered. "Tell David. Absalom will march within 2 days. They'll come hard, fast. They want to end this quickly." Jonathan nodded and vanished into the trees like a ghost, and Hushai, faithful, careful Hushai, returned to the palace with dust on his sandals and fire in his spirit. Because God had placed him in the shadows of a throne for this very reason. He wasn't there to be seen. He was there to protect what mattered, even if it meant walking a tightrope between truth and treason. The palace bustled louder the next day. What had once been uneasy silence turned into a storm of preparation. Soldiers trained in the courtyard. Horses were shod with iron. And Absalom, dressed in regal purple, summoned his advisors one by one. Hushai was among the last to be called. He walked calmly through the golden archways, passing guards who bowed half-heartedly, still unsure if their loyalty belonged to the prince or the throne he had taken. Inside the council room, the tension hung like a curtain. Absalom stood at the head of a long cedar table, a large map stretched before him. Around the edges, his commanders whispered in tight clusters. One pointed at the Jordan River. Another drew circles around key towns. "We strike tomorrow," Absalom declared. Some nodded, others hesitated. "We'll catch David before he can regroup," he said confidently. "He's tired. His men are few. The people are already calling me king." Then he turned to Hushai. "You've known him longer than anyone here. What will David do?" All eyes shifted. Hushai stepped closer to the table, pretending to study the map. "He's a lion when cornered," Hushai said slowly. "But more than that, he's wise. He'll avoid a direct fight. He'll use the hills, the forests, guerrilla tactics. He'll protect the ark, the priests, the weak. He'll try to wait you out." Absalom frowned. "So what do you suggest?" Hushai looked around, choosing his words carefully. "Your strength is your image," he said. "If you fall into a trap, your men will lose heart. But if you gather the full force of Israel, every tribe, every fighter, and then lead them yourself with power and glory, the people will fear you, and David will have no place left to run." The room was quiet. Then one general whispered, "It will take longer to gather the tribes." Absalom leaned back. "But it will make my reign undeniable." He looked back at Hushai. "Very well. We wait. Send the orders." That night, Hushai rushed to the priest's hiding place, hidden beneath a crumbling storehouse near the city wall. "Tell David," he said breathlessly. "The plan worked. He has at least 3 days, maybe more, but he must cross the river tonight. If he doesn't—" Zadok didn't let him finish. He turned to his sons. "Go! Ride like the wind! Get the message across before dawn!" Jonathan and Ahimaaz vanished into the shadows. Hushai slumped against the wall, exhaustion catching up with him. "You've done well," Abiathar whispered. "No," Hushai said, eyes closed. "God has done well. I'm just trying to keep up." Meanwhile, across the wilderness, David's camp burned low fires beneath a blanket of stars. He sat near the edge of the river, watching the waters shimmer under moonlight. His men were tired, some wounded, some doubtful. But as Jonathan arrived with the message, "Absalom delays. You have time. Cross now." A spark returned to the king's eyes. "Tell Hushai," David said quietly, "I owe him more than I can ever repay." Then he stood, called for his commanders, and prepared to move. And far behind, in the city that still called Absalom king, a faithful friend watched the stars and whispered, "Lord, keep them safe. Protect your promise." The sun rose over Jerusalem in a haze of gold and smoke. From the palace rooftop, Hushai could see the kingdom split in two, not in borders, but in loyalty. Some people cheered Absalom's name in the streets. Others stayed silent, their eyes filled with fear and longing. Inside, the palace buzzed with ambition. Absalom was hosting a feast. It was a move meant to show confidence, lavish displays of food, bright banners fluttering, music echoing through marble halls. But under it all, the cracks were starting to show. Hushai sat near the end of the long table, hands folded, eyes watchful. Absalom lifted his goblet. "To a new day in Israel, to a kingdom united." The crowd gave a scattered cheer, but one commander leaned toward another and whispered, "United?" The north obeys out of fear, the priests hide in cellars, and David's men still roam the hills. Hushai didn't speak, but he listened to everything. A shadow fell over the doorway, and into the room stepped Ahithophel, Absalom's most feared advisor. He looked directly at Absalom. "You shouldn't have waited. David has crossed the Jordan. You've lost the advantage." Murmurs rippled through the table. Absalom's smile faltered. It was a strategy, a grand entrance, a show of force. Ahithophel's face remained stone. "Your father is a warrior. You've given him room to breathe. He will not waste it." The room fell quiet. For a moment even the music stopped, and then Hushai stood. "With respect," he said calmly, "we still hold the capital. We have the numbers. The people want peace. If we show confidence, the countryside will follow." Absalom nodded slowly, torn between the two advisors. "Enough," he said. "We'll send scouts. Then we'll see who's right." That night, Ahithophel left the palace without a word. He had given one counsel, and it was rejected. And for a man like him, used to winning, used to being feared, disgrace was unbearable. By dawn, the news spread quietly. Ahithophel had taken his own life. The kingdom shuddered. And Hushai, though sad, whispered a silent prayer. Thank you, Lord, for turning his wisdom to foolishness. Outside the city, the wilderness bristled with movement. David's forces grew each day, small bands joining one by one, messengers coming with loyalty oaths, warriors returning from exile. God's hand was moving, quietly but surely. And deep in that wilderness, Joab approached David. "We can strike now," Joab said. "They're still uncertain. One strong push could turn everything." David hesitated. "I don't want war with my son," he whispered. Joab's jaw clenched. "But he's bringing war to you." David nodded, eyes full of sorrow. "Then so be it. But no one is to harm Absalom. Promise me that, Joab." Joab didn't answer, but he bowed. The battle was coming. And everyone knew when the dust cleared, Israel would have one king. The forest of Ephraim was no ordinary battlefield. It twisted and turned with uneven roots and steep ravines, thick with low branches and shadows that moved even when the wind was still. The deeper you went, the harder it was to tell friend from foe. David's army had chosen this place carefully, not for beauty, but for strategy. They knew its secrets. Absalom's troops, larger and louder, would find no advantage here. At the edge of the woods, Hushai stood with a scout. "They'll be overconfident," Hushai said, narrowing his eyes toward the hills. "They think numbers always win." The scout nodded. "And our men? They know these trees like old friends." Meanwhile, Absalom was restless. He had insisted on leading the charge himself, his long hair tied back, his armor polished to a mirror shine. Pride shimmered in his eyes as he looked across the valley. "This is the moment," he told his captains. "We finish what I started." "But the forest," one of them hesitated. "I said charge." And they did. Trumpets blasted, hooves thundered, swords flashed in the morning light. But as they entered the woods, the forest swallowed them whole. David's men emerged like shadows, striking and vanishing. Every path Absalom's army took led to confusion. Horses tripped, men stumbled, units became separated. Some turned on each other by accident in the thick fog of war. Joab's commander smiled grimly. "The forest fights with us." Absalom rode hard, frustration burning in his chest. He pulled left, then right, but everywhere chaos followed. Branches snapped, screams echoed, and then, as he ducked to avoid a low limb, his long hair caught in a twisted oak. The horse kept going. Absalom didn't. He hung, stunned, helpless, suspended between earth and sky. His sword had fallen. His cries were muffled by the battle. And then Joab found him. Far from the battlefield, Hushai stood with an elder near a watchtower. They saw the messenger riding fast, his robes torn, his face pale. "It's over," the young man called. "David's army has won." A cheer rose from the hillside, but Hushai didn't smile. "Not yet," he asked. "And the prince?" The messenger looked away. Joab did not spare him. Hushai lowered his head. He was proud, but he was still David's son. That night, as the fire crackled and tents were pitched in peace for the first time in days, David wept. "My son, Absalom," my son." And Hushai watched from a distance. He knew this victory had come at great cost. He also knew that loyalty didn't always end in celebration. Sometimes it ended in sorrow, but still, it mattered. Because God's plan had been protected. David's throne remained. And for now, that was enough. The city was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy silence that lingers after something breaks. Jerusalem had seen war before, but this was different. The rebellion hadn't reached its walls, yet the people felt the weight of it anyway, because what broke this time wasn't stone or sword, it was a father's heart. David returned to the palace with dust still on his robes. His head was low, not like a king returning in triumph, but like a father mourning something too deep for words. The cheers that greeted him were awkward and half-hearted. Some of the people clapped, others just stared. Only a few really understood, and Hushai was one of them. He stood quietly in a corner of the outer court, watching the gates open. When David passed by, their eyes met for just a second, and Hushai bowed his head. He didn't need to say anything. Loyalty didn't always speak. Sometimes it simply stood nearby. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was cold. Some advisors whispered about moving on quickly. The people need to see strength. Others tiptoed around the topic of Joab. He disobeyed the king's order by killing Absalom. David said little. He barely ate, barely spoke. Until the third day, when he finally asked, "Where is Hushai?" They sent for him immediately. Hushai arrived quietly, the same way he always did. No fanfare, no titles. Just steady footsteps and kind eyes. David sat alone in the throne room, his crown still resting on the table beside him, not yet on his head. "Did I do the right thing, Hushai?" he asked softly. "Did I save a kingdom or lose a son?" Hushai's voice was calm. "Sometimes a king must carry wounds the people never see, but the kingdom still stands." David nodded slowly. "I wanted him to return, alive." "I know," Hushai said, "but he chose a different path." The silence stretched again. Then Hushai added, "You are still God's chosen. The throne wasn't protected because of you, but because of him. You were the vessel. He was the shield." David looked up, his eyes tired but grateful. "And you," he said, "were the friend I didn't deserve." Later that evening, Hushai walked the palace grounds alone. He passed the gardens where Absalom used to laugh as a boy, the stables where David once raced his sons on foot, the balcony where news of the rebellion first arrived. Everything had changed, but something deeper had been preserved, not just a throne, but a promise. Because even when kings fall short and sons rebel and hearts break, God still uses the loyal ones placed in the right time, at the right side, for the sake of his plan. And Hushai? He never raised a sword, but he helped win the war. There was no silence now. Jerusalem buzzed with tension, not from the clang of swords, but from the crackle of uneasy peace. Royal messengers hurried through corridors. Priests dusted off scrolls they hadn't touched in years. Spies, too many spies, pretended to sweep floors or carry water jugs through the palace, always listening, always watching. And Hushai knew it. "Someone's stirring the pot again," Nathan the prophet muttered as they crossed paths outside the king's council chamber. Hushai gave a quiet nod. "Someone always is." This time the trouble didn't wear armor or ride in from Hebron. It wore royal robes and walked with entitlement. Adonijah, David's older son, had begun throwing parties in his honor and calling himself the next king. He's building a chariot team, one of Hushai's informants whispered in the courtyard, and Joab's been visiting his home at night. That last part stung. Joab, the general who once helped save David's kingdom, was now slipping into shadows. Loyalty, Hushai realized, was more rare than gold in this palace. So he did what he did best. He listened, he observed, and then he quietly stepped into the chamber of Bathsheba, Solomon's mother. "My lady," he said, bowing respectfully, "forgive the intrusion. But we don't have much time." Bathsheba turned from the window. She had the calmness of someone who had survived too much to panic now. "Adonijah?" "He's moving faster than anyone expected." "Solomon is young," she said, "not unwise, but untested." "And you," Hushai replied, "are still the only one David listens to." She tilted her head. "So what do you suggest?" "You remind him of the promise, tonight, before Adonijah calls himself king out loud." Bathsheba nodded slowly. Then she smiled, just a little. "You've always been 2 steps ahead, Hushai." He bowed again. "That's why I'm still alive." That evening, as shadows lengthened across the palace rooftop, Bathsheba entered David's chamber and knelt beside the old king's bed. Her voice was soft, but steady. She reminded him of his oath, that Solomon would be king, that the promise had been made before God. David, weary and gray, opened his eyes, and for the first time in days, he sat up straight. "Call the prophet, call the priest. Tell them to anoint Solomon, today." By nightfall, Jerusalem rang with trumpet blasts. Solomon rode David's own mule through the city, and the people cheered. God's plan hadn't been hijacked, not this time. And in the quiet behind the celebration, Hushai stood in the shadows of a column, watching the joy unfold. He didn't hold a crown. He didn't give a speech, but his steps, his words, his watchful wisdom had helped guide the kingdom yet again. Because God places loyal people in strategic places, not for glory, but for protection, and while the throne stood firm in Solomon's name, the silent victory belonged to the friend in the background. The celebration had faded, but not the tension. Torches burned low in the palace corridors as guards whispered about what Adonijah might do next. He hadn't shown his face since Solomon's anointing. Word spread that he had fled to the altar, grabbing the horns and begging for mercy. Hushai watched from a terrace, arms folded. "You look like a man who hasn't slept," Zadok the priest said quietly behind him. Hushai didn't turn. Sleep is for people who don't know how fast peace can vanish. Below them, the city of Jerusalem stretched out, dark and quiet. But even in that silence, Hushai knew rebellion didn't die with a trumpet blast. It hid. It plotted. "Do you think he'll strike again?" Zadok asked. "Not right away. But ambition doesn't go away. It only changes faces." Days passed. Solomon, now king in full, called a private meeting. Only a few men were invited: Zadok, Nathan, Benaiah, and Hushai. "I'm grateful to you all," Solomon said, "but I need to know who is truly with me. The kingdom is still fragile." "You've done well so far," Hushai said, "but this is the beginning, not the end." Solomon nodded. "And Adonijah?" "He's afraid," Benaiah said. clinging to the altar like a guilty man. He is guilty, Nathan added. He tried to steal what God gave. Solomon looked to Hushai last. He'll behave, Hushai said slowly. But if he asks for more, anything more, it won't be by accident. And sure enough, days later, a servant arrived, breathless. Adonijah has sent a request. Hushai's stomach tightened. What does he want? Solomon asked. The servant hesitated. He asks to marry Abishag, the woman who once cared for your father. The room froze. Hushai didn't blink. He's testing your resolve. In the eyes of the people, taking Abishag would be like claiming your father's crown again. Solomon's face hardened. Then I can't let that slide. That night, justice was carried out. And though the palace seemed calm again, Hushai knew. Being king wasn't just about wisdom. It was about watching the cracks before they became fractures. Later, in the solitude of the inner court, Solomon found Hushai again. Was I too harsh? He asked. Hushai took a long breath. A weak king forgives everyone. A cruel king destroys everyone. But a wise king, he learns to judge rightly. Solomon stared into the garden lights. And what do you think I am? Hushai smiled. I think you're still becoming. The young king nodded, and in the moonlight, 2 generations stood side by side, one rising, one steady, both chosen for their roles in the unfolding plan of God. Because sometimes the most important voices are not the loudest. They are the loyal ones in the shadows. The sun had barely risen when a quiet knock came to Hushai's quarters. It wasn't a servant, it wasn't a soldier, it was Solomon. Dressed in a simple cloak, the young king looked more like a shepherd than a ruler. I didn't wake you, did I? Solomon asked. I haven't slept, Hushai replied, fastening his belt. Too much peace lately. Makes a man suspicious. Solomon chuckled faintly, but his eyes were serious. Come walk with me. They strolled through the upper gardens, where dew clung to the pomegranate leaves and birds tested the morning air. The hush before the city's stirring felt sacred, as though heaven leaned in to listen. I've been thinking about my father, Solomon began, about how often he was misunderstood, even when he was right. He was complicated, Hushai said, but he was also beloved. And you stayed, Solomon said. You stayed when it would have been safer to disappear. Hushai stopped. Because loyalty isn't loyalty if it's only for the good days. The young king looked down. I wonder sometimes if I'm strong enough, wise enough. Just yesterday I passed judgment on my own brother. Tomorrow, who knows what test will come? Tests will always come, Hushai said, but you're not called to see everything. You're called to obey the God who does. Solomon looked up slowly, as if the words settled something inside him. Later that week, Hushai sat on the palace steps watching children chase each other across the courtyard. One boy, barefoot and laughing, looked just like Absalom had once looked, free, unburdened. A shadow approached. Old friend, Nathan the prophet said, lowering himself beside Hushai, you planning on ever resting? Eventually, Hushai replied, but for now, I still have eyes. Nathan smiled. The Lord sees too. That's why I stay ready. Nathan paused. Do you ever regret it? Being the man in the background? Hushai's answer came without hesitation. Number. Because I know where the real battle is. And it's not always out there. It's in the loyalty of a heart. That evening, Solomon rose before the people and prayed aloud in the temple for the first time. The courtyard was full. The air shimmered with reverence. But tucked behind a pillar, unseen by most, stood Hushai, listening, smiling. Not because his name would be remembered by the crowd, but because he had played his part well. This is the story of Hushai, a man of loyalty, a man of wisdom, a man placed by God in the right place at the right time to protect a kingdom and a future king. Because God still places loyal people in strategic places to protect his plans, and Hushai was one of them. The doors to the king's inner chamber creaked open. Absalom leaned forward, hands steepled under his chin. "Tell me, Hushai," he said, "you saw my father flee like a coward. What now?" Hushai kept his face steady, even as his heart pounded. The plan was working, but this moment could break everything. "You want victory, Absalom?" Hushai said calmly. "Then don't rush. Your father is dangerous when cornered. Gather all Israel to you. Let them see your strength. Then crush him in one stroke." Absalom nodded slowly, intrigued. "Ahithophel told me to attack tonight." "Then Ahithophel forgets who David is," Hushai replied. "This man hid from Saul for years and lived. If you rush him now, you'll only send your men into an ambush. Wait, strike once, and strike with everything." The room was silent. Finally, Absalom smiled. "You've spoken well. We'll do it your way." And just like that, God's plan held. Outside the city, two messengers waited in the shadows, young men loyal to David. Hushai slipped them the message: "Delay is coming. Prepare." By nightfall, David and his people were crossing the Jordan. The trap would never be sprung. And Ahithophel? When he heard his counsel had been rejected, he saddled his donkey in silence, returned home, and ended his own life. Even the wisest man falls when pride leads. But a loyal man, placed in the right moment, can turn the tide of history. David sat in the hill country, watching the rising sun touch the edges of the Jordan. He was alive. Judah was still his. And soon, his son would be coming, not with peace, but with war. Beside him, Hushai stood quietly. "You saved me," David said finally, voice rough with exhaustion. "No throne, no title, no thanks can repay that." "I didn't do it for reward," Hushai replied softly. "I did it because I knew what God wanted." David turned to him, eyes full of sorrow. "My son's coming for me. I don't know if I'll see him again as a father or as an enemy." "Then pray God gives him ears to hear." But Absalom didn't come to listen. He came to conquer. The battle that followed was swift and brutal. David's forces, though smaller, had time and terrain on their side. And in the end, Absalom's pride, riding high on a mule under a tangled oak, left him hanging by his own hair, exposed and helpless. David wept when he heard, "My son, my son!" Hushai remained by his side, loyal to the end. In the years to come, David would write songs of pain and mercy, of betrayal and deliverance. And when he sang of friends who stood close when others betrayed, Hushai's name lingered between the lines. Because God did place him there, in the palace, in the tension, in the storm. Not because he was the loudest, not because he had power, but because he was loyal. And when God places someone loyal in the right place, his plans will never fail.